A quick note before starting. There are times here and there when there might be a few seconds between sections of what I'm saying about a given image, and you may think it's time to advance to the next image when it's not. So let the images advance on their own to be sure you don't miss any of the narration. By about 1910, most of the manifestations of Art Nouveau had run their course. Each was so unusual and unique that for the most part they appealed only to small groups of sophisticated consumers, and after a time even they began to lose interest. So the period between 1900 and the end of World War I in 1918 became a period of intense questioning and experimentation in terms of the question that had begun at the end of the previous century. What should design in the new century look like? The architects we're going to look at here are referred to as Forerunners because their work is considered to have made a tremendous contribution to the development of modernism. So by Forerunners, we mean Forerunners of modernism. A few important points about this group. They were not a formal or official group. They didn't even hang out together like the Easteats. Each was more or less aware of what the others were doing because they were paying attention to the latest progressive developments in architecture and design in their own and in other countries. But they developed their ideas and work independently. That said, they were all concerned with solving the same problems, which were developing new ways of thinking about and using floor plans, ornament, form and function, and new materials and techniques. Various authors may include others in addition to these, and some may not include all that I mention here, but there's no question about the ones in red, and I'll be talking about most of them in this lecture. But I'm going to start with Louis Sullivan, who was working well in advance of the others. So is he a forerunner, or is he Art Nouveau, or both, or neither? You decide. Anyway, what matters is not the label, but what he thought, what he said, and what he did. Louis Sullivan was one of Frank Lloyd Wright's early employers and is associated with what is known as the Chicago School of Architecture. Much as it is today, in the 19th century, Chicago was an international hub of transport and commerce, and the decimation of the old wooden city by fire in 1871 created a tremendous opportunity for architects like Sullivan, not only in terms of volume of work available, but also in that they had at their disposal many new materials and engineering systems, including the elevator, to experiment with. Moreover, they were working with a clean slate, as it were. Before this time, America had been following the lead of Britain and Europe in architecture, designing large public buildings in one or more of the Revival styles or Beaux-Arts style. But in 1871, Sullivan saw the situation as a way to really think about what kind of buildings these new corporations, department stores, and other businesses actually needed to function well. You may have already noticed that some aspects of Sullivan and his work place him firmly in the Art Nouveau camp. The use of nature, the organic vining matter that seems to be supporting the cornice, and if you could see it, the rest of the surface of the building, ornamented with low-relief, stylized organic elements. And, perhaps most of all, the symbolist poem he wrote, which I've noted here, evoking the idea of the mystical, of bringing the unseen into the seen, and the importance of nature in that process. But do you recognize the one element that defines him without question as a major influence on modernism? I made it red. Quote, "Form ever follows function," which became and still is the mantra of modernism and much that followed it. So how did he apply this? Sullivan is also considered a forerunner because after much consideration of what form these new buildings should have in order to best fulfill their function, he developed the basic form of the, quote, tall office building, which is the foundation of the skyscrapers we have today. And what did he base that on? Well, as you can see here, the form of the column, a solid base to support all above it, housing retail space. The shaft of uniform floors, accessible by elevator to house the offices, and the cornice at the top, which he treats like the capital of a column, accentuating it with leaves, recalling the origins of the column itself in trees and other plant matter. Simple, logical, ingenious, and meaningful, as the column had of course been part of the Western architectural tradition since its inception. Even though Frank Lloyd Wright and Sullivan fell out early on in Wright's career, the latter continued to acknowledge Sullivan with great respect and as his most influential mentor for the rest of his life. But when we talk about Wright, we have to talk about a powerful source of influence that had very little to do with the Chicago School, and that is the architecture of Japan, to which Wright was directly exposed via the World Columbian Exhibition in 1893, held in Chicago. As we look at Wright's early solo residential work, keep this image in mind. But like Sullivan, Wright was very keen to develop a new kind of architecture based not on European prototypes but on the American experience. And that style, and the architects who followed Wright in this, came to be known as Prairie School. As I've noted here, and as Wright initially referred to it, it is an organic architecture. That is, it is connected to the earth. Illinois is in the Midwest, an area of the country where vast plains of flat land are common, creating vistas of long, low horizon lines. As we've seen throughout history, this concept of horizontalness always communicates a feeling of closeness to the earth, as opposed to vertical lines that are associated with reaching up to the heavens and otherworldliness, right? Of course, this was also a quality of Japanese architecture, which, as you recall, consisted of one level of organically composed spaces spread out across the site. In Prairie School architecture, we see long, low structures that hug and follow the horizon line, accentuated by an emphasis on several horizontal bands of stringing. And the large overhanging eaves seen here, also inspired by Japanese architecture, provide a sense of protection, so valuable when traversing a long, flat, empty expanse. Plains can be almost like deserts, the sun beating down upon a vast terrain with few or no trees. An outcropping of rock is sometimes all there is to provide a respite from the heat or shelter from a powerful thunderstorm. So this sense of protection becomes an important theme in Prairie School architecture. We also see it expressed in the deep porches created sometimes by the eaves, sometimes, as we see here, by almost what appear to be interior rooms from which the window walls have been removed. Finally, of course, there are the natural earth tones of the materials and finishes. The arched entryway is a literal reference to the work of Louis Sullivan and another important Chicago school architect who is sometimes counted among the Forerunners, Henry Hobson Richardson, while the slightly turned up edges of some of the eaves pay homage to their Japanese sources. As Wright's work matures, these references disappear. But for now, let's take a look at the interior of the Dana House. Again, like the landscape of the American Midwest, one traverses the interior as one would journey across the plains. Evident in the image on the bottom, the terrain is usually long, low, and flat, interrupted only by outcroppings of rock, the furniture groupings, that define different locations. But as expressed in the upper image, one might also encounter larger configurations of hill and or rock now and then that create intermittent levels and platforms to which one can ascend to a variety of vantage points. What you also see here is Wright's indebtedness to the arts and crafts movement, with both the interior architecture and the furniture based on what he saw in and learned from that tradition. Note in particular the inglenook he created at the fireplace. By 1908, we see the full flowering of Wright's new style in Roby House. As in Red House, we see him using brick, a traditional vernacular material, which translates to cozy, comfortable, residential, traditional, and authentic. But these are not your everyday rustic bricks. He had them made especially smooth in finish and to a dimension that emphasized their horizontality. The result? A sleek, smooth surface that suggests brick to us, but then again, we know it's something new. Cancel, wait. By 1908, we see the full flowering of Wright's new style in Roby House. As in Morris's Red House, we see him using brick, a traditional vernacular material which translates to cozy, comfortable, residential, authentic. But these are not your everyday rustic bricks. He had them made especially smooth in finish and to a dimension that emphasized their horizontality. The result? A sleek, smooth surface that we read on some level as brick, but also as something new and different. Like Morris, too, he has stripped away any and all unnecessary detail, not only the brick texture, but all surface texture, as compared to Dana House, as well as the literal references to Japanese and Chicago school architecture. The new material he uses for the stringing, poured concrete, creates powerful, vibrant white lines against the red brick, maximizing the horizontal emphasis. In these views, you can also get a good sense of the depth of some of the eaves, the porches they create, and that sense of a fluid boundary between inside and out. When exactly are you outside, and when exactly are you inside? In these views, too, you can see the individual geometric volumes comprising the structure, but also, very apparent, is the stacking and floating of various planes in space. Through both volume and plane, you start to sense the organic, intermittent, interlocking levels occurring on the inside. With these, we also see another signature of Wright's style at this time, which is how the floating planes seem to be all connected and pinned down at the center by the fireplace. And, as we'll see, the cultural importance of the arts and crafts fireplace, a totally British phenomenon, is adapted by Wright to suit his prairie school, that is, American design concept. Here, a plan of the main floor, showing the center of the house as one completely open, continuous space. If you think back to what Bailey Scott was doing in England circa 1900, you'll realize what led to this. Also on this page, for your reference, a summary of Prairie School design. Here, several of Frank Lloyd Wright's signature motifs. First, the windows. Basically, the two main walls of the room are all glass. However, it doesn't feel like that. It's not as if they're crystal clear walls of plate glass. The windows are large, yes, but separated by thick sections of wall, which serve to remind you that there is, in fact, heavy-duty structure protecting you from the outside. And the addition of the leaded glass patterning further serves as a reminder that there is something there. They're not just wide open holes exposing you to the elements. Second, uniting the space with line, created by millwork trim, which also houses the lighting and electrical conduit. Next, the open plan is clearly expressed, circulating around the central hearth, which is perhaps the most important feature, the fire as the heart of the house. But unlike the medieval, that is, the European hearth motif, this one is set down into the earth, creating a fire pit around which people would sit on the ground, thereby evoking the practices of the people, the Indians indigenous to the American Midwestern plains. This type of leaded glass window design is also typical of Wright and was usually derived from stylizing or abstracting indigenous plant forms. Also here, a better view of his treatment of architectural lighting. Electric lights were still fairly new, and architects, especially those concerned with creating a unified, holistic design, were experimenting with how to work lighting into the design rather than just placing several lamps around the space. Many of the same themes are seen here in the dining room. Unifying the space with millwork line that also serves a functional purpose, experimenting with lighting, even building the fixtures into the dining table itself by extending each of the legs up to form lamp posts. Wright's furniture is usually of simple oak construction and clearly inspired by the arts and crafts dictum of truth in materials and construction. Japanese form and lines are also evident here, both directly and as interpreted by Mackintosh. The tall, slender lines of the chair backs, which recall Mackintosh, altogether create a fence-like feeling around the table, sheltering and secluding the diners. Wright felt that the family gathering to eat was almost a sacred ritual and should be protected from outside interference. The sideboard also expresses the influence of Japanese design and its built-in character, along with other similar areas of the room that are not clearly evident, reflect his desire to create a unified, total work of art in the Art Nouveau manner. Here, some classic Wright chair designs from this era. The one just seen, the other two, though, very different and important in that what we see is him playing with pure geometric form, with planes floating and resting in a kind of grid that forms the basic structure of the chair. This kind of thinking and experimentation is exactly the type that will lead to modernism and is what makes him a forerunner. Even the desk, whose connection to Japanese design is clear, also shows him a bit more interested in floating planes than anything else. On the other hand, in these pieces of furniture, traditional, classical elements are clearly expressed, and you should be able to ID them, so I'm not going to tell you what they are. Why would he do this? Most likely to satisfy the client. While many wanted modern design by one of the most progressive architects, they were also often still attached to certain common symbols of sophistication and success. As we've seen, in America in particular, that meant classicism, the Renaissance, etc. And since artistic freedom allowed Wright to draw upon any and all sources of inspiration, he could feel comfortable bringing in these references if and when required. However, this leaded glass design of the same era shows he continued his evolution in the avant-garde realm as well. He's no longer working with abstracted plant forms, but with pure abstract form, circles, squares, and rectangles, as well as with primary colors, the fundamentals, the essence of all matter. And in this we see evidence of his awareness and embrace of the latest and most advanced development in the fine arts in centuries, the emergence of abstraction in painting. Here, two of the most important artists and iconic works of this genre and era. Both are paintings which, for the first time, are completely non-representational. Most people are familiar with Kandinsky's work, as their rich colors and dynamism have a powerful, emotional, sensual, and decorative appeal. But as we will see, it is the more reserved, intellectual, and geometric version, as seen in the Malevich on the left, which will have the most influence on modernism. One of the most important forerunners in this regard is actually the work and ideas of a group of artists, architects, and craftsmen from Holland. Its leader and primary theorist was Theo van Doesburg, whose magazine, De Stijl, or The Style, first published in 1917, was the main vehicle for the group's ideas and beliefs. An important contributing factor to the aesthetic they developed was, in fact, the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, which became known to them and others among the European avant-garde when collections of Wright's designs began being published there in 1910. Here, one of the drawings from those publications, along with two pieces by the architect and cabinet maker Gerrit Rietveld, which clearly embody and express Wright's interest in floating planes within a grid. But for the De Stijl designers, there was much more at stake than just developing a new vocabulary for furniture design. The shock and revulsion the world felt during and after World War I cannot be overstated. The first war to be fought with the aid of machines, such as tanks, chemical weapons, and machine guns. The Great War, as it was called, took the lives of 37 million people in horrific fashion and still ranks as one of the worst wars in human history. During and immediately following it, thoughtful people, shaken to their core, cast about for ways to prevent this ever happening again. And as we know, since at least the time of Pugin and Morris, architects and designers had been concerned with solving deep socio-political and economic problems through design. So it was only natural that they should again want to make a significant contribution. What I state in the box here is the essence of de Stiel's solution to this problem. It was a fact that one of the primary causes of the conflict was nationalism, the severe tension between nations like France, England, Italy, Austria-Hungary. In other words, patriotism, national identity. So de Stiel proposed removing all elements of individual identity, all ego, on both the personal and national level. Quite simply, if everyone is the same, then there will be no conflict. And how do we do this? Much the same as the 19th century design reformers did, when they wanted to remove all associations with the past, with history, with the style of a particular country at a certain point in time. Remove all the details, remove all the symbols, stylize and abstract the forms. Then remove all color as well, so there is no chance of making any kind of personal connection. Moreover, when something is abstracted, reduced to its most minimal, to its essence, it is then most truthful and most pure. And when the world is based on truth and purity, how can there be hatred and conflict? Like William Morris's ideas of creating a perfect society through a return to a more innocent time, de Stiel's goal was the creation of a utopia. How did de Stiel express these beliefs in art and design? Quite simply, as I show you here. They envisioned creation as a universal grid system, represented by the black lines we see in Mondrian's painting. And the architect-designer creates form by bringing together planes at a certain point in a certain configuration. Van Doesburg's composition on the right shows how planes that are free-floating in the universe are brought together and fixed in one spot to result in a chair, a cabinet, or a house. So adamant were they about pure geometric form that at first circles were not even allowed. And rather than no color, which would make it too difficult to identify the form in space, they allowed the use of primary colors along with gray, white, and black. While most of their work consisted of theoretical images or abstract painting, in the early 1920s, Gerrit Rietveld was engaged to build a house based upon these ideas. Schroeder House was designed by Rietveld for a woman who obviously agreed with these concepts. And as you can see, even from the outside, it clearly expresses the idea of planes floating in a grid in space. Here and in the next image, you can see how the grid has become tracks for sliding, moving, floating planes that allow the small space to be adapted to a variety of uses. All color is red, blue, yellow, black, gray, or white, with the white areas often feeling just like open sky in which these floating geometric forms have come together. Here, the introduction of a circle serves as the base for a table composed of floating planes. Apparently, Mondrian was so upset by the introduction of circles into the vocabulary that he left the group. Here, the famous red and blue chair from this project, alongside one of Frank Lloyd Wright's early chairs to recall that connection. But the red and blue chair clearly expresses the de Stiel theory of objects as nothing more than planes suspended within an infinite grid. The yellow paint at the ends of the black framing elements expresses the innate life energy of the grid emanating from the points where it was cut. Another of the most important forerunners is someone who will himself become not only one of the most important architects of modernism, but of the 20th century. Like Frank Lloyd Wright, Charles-Édouard Généré's style evolved over the decades, and he produced many important and unique structures around the world before his death in 1965. Though he spent much of his life in France, he was actually born, raised, and educated in Switzerland. From 1907, he traveled throughout Europe and the Mediterranean and worked as an architect and designer in both Paris and Berlin, with and among the most important tastemakers of the era preceding World War I, when France and Germany were both ardently trying to formulate a new modern style with broad international appeal. The so-called domino prototype shown here, developed by him in 1915, marked a major evolutionary step in the open floor plan. But his most important contribution came after he met the painter Amédée Ozenfant in 1917, with whom he developed a long-term relationship. It was at this point that he changed his name to Le Corbusier to signify a disavowing of his old life and an embrace of a completely new identity. The name actually doesn't mean anything in French, but it has some kind of personal significance for him. Together, they developed a style of painting that represented their theory of purism, which, as you will see, also offered answers to questions about how to conceive new design, what it should look like, and why. As the name purism suggests, it is closely related to what de Stijl was striving for, but for different reasons and from a totally different viewpoint. While abstract painters and theorists like de Stijl, for the most part, focused on ideal geometric forms as the most universal and pure, Le Corbusier was attracted to the functional and practical forms that the human race had already perfected. Objects like a wine bottle, a guitar, and a pipe, for example, are perfect forms. At some point in the past, after decades or even centuries of experimentation, the ideal form for these functions had been achieved, perfected, and they haven't been changed since. Le Corbusier pointed out that there are already many such forms we can draw upon for contemporary living, and for those we need that do not exist, we can develop new ones by looking to existing perfected forms for guidance. For example, as we know, the Greeks had succeeded in perfecting the temple form, which could serve as a model for new, perfect forms of architecture. And we'll see just how he himself used this concept when we return to him as we examine modernism. Last, but by no means least, the German Walter Gropius. As early as 1912, he was creating structures that would lead directly to his formation of the new modern style in architecture, later to be known as the International Style. He will create this style at the Bauhaus, of which he is also quite famous for being the first director. And it is with the Bauhaus that our study of modernism will begin at the next lecture.